At 0956 hours local time, a solitary Ukrainian MiG-29 Fulcrum was clawing for altitude through the dense cloud layer at 1,000 feet toward the hostile sector designated as Ork. The pilot's mission objective was deceptively simple: deliver a payload of precision-guided munitions to obliterate a Russian logistics hub and ammunition depot that had been fueling the offensive in the south. The flight had been a textbook routine for the past 12 minutes, but unknown to the pilot, a Russian S-400 Triumph battery positioned near Melitopol had just achieved a hard radar lock on his airframe at a range of 120 kilometers. The steady, high-pitched tone of the radar warning receiver in his headset hit him like a physical punch to the gut, instantly spiking his heart rate from a resting 70 to 140 beats per minute. The Russian operators hadn't just detected him, they had already launched. A 48 N6 missile, 180 kilometers of explosive bad news, was already accelerating past Mach 2 in its first second of flight, burning through solid propellant at a rate that would make a drag racer weep. The mathematics of the engagement were brutal and unforgiving. At this specific range and closure rate, the pilot calculated an impact in exactly 80 seconds, maybe 90 if the laws of probability decided to be generous today. But in the cockpit, hope is not a strategy. The pilot immediately yanked the control stick hard to the right while simultaneously punching the chaff dispense button, forcing the MiG into a 90-degree aspect angle relative to the incoming radar beam, a desperate maneuver pilots call notching. He held the aircraft in a stomach-churning perpendicular, heading for 8 agonizing seconds while the countermeasure system spit out programmed bursts of aluminized glass fibers. These dipoles created a slowly expanding cloud moving at the ambient wind speed, with each individual strip reflecting radar energy like thousands of tiny mirrors, effectively making one 20-ton aircraft look like a squadron of 100 ghosts on the enemy scope. The Russian system's algorithms frantically tried to sort the fighter from the false returns and the ground clutter, but at this precise aspect angle, the physics of Doppler processing turned against them. The reason this maneuver worked is rooted in the fundamental physics of how the S-400's radar actually sees the world. The system uses Doppler processing to separate moving targets from the static background noise of mountains and trees by measuring the frequency shift of the radar return, essentially the same principle that makes a passing ambulance siren change pitch. However, when a pilot flies perfectly perpendicular to the radar source, the relative velocity toward or away from the dish becomes zero. To the Doppler processor, the MiG-29 suddenly stops looking like a speeding fighter jet and starts looking exactly like a stationary mountain, causing the system to filter it out as ground clutter. The track quality on the Russian screens degraded from solid to intermittent, and finally to lost. The 48 N6 missile, suddenly deprived of mid-course guidance updates, switched to its backup inertial mode, flying blindly toward the last predicted intercept point where the computer thought the plane should be. But the pilot, knowing that physics doesn't negotiate, had already changed course and was diving for the deck. The missile's onboard active radar seeker activated in the terminal phase, searching for a target that was now 2 kilometers away and obscured by a wall of chaff. Its proximity fuse found nothing but a cloud of falling aluminum rain, and the warhead detonated harmlessly, sending thousands of tungsten fragments shredding through the empty sky. The pilot leveled off at 500 feet, checking his 6 o'clock through the mirrors. The Russian Gravestone radar uses thousands of individual transmitter-receiver modules that can steer their beam electronically, jumping from the horizon to the zenith in microseconds. Unlike older Soviet systems that give up when they lose a track, this digital predator remembers. It stores the target's last position, heading, and speed, calculates a probability box of where the aircraft likely went, and starts searching there first. Pilot had bought himself maybe 30 seconds of life, but the clock was already ticking down again. The Russian operators at the S-400 command post were already adapting to the situation by switching their engagement logic to a different radar mode. And that is when they activated bistatic mode, turning the pilot's clever escape into a mathematical trap. In bistatic mode, the radar system effectively splits itself in two. The massive transmitter stays at the original site near Melitopol, blasting out energy, but a passive receiver sits 40 kilometers away at a completely different angle. Think of it like a dark room. Normally, a radar is like holding a flashlight where the bulb and your eyes are in the same place. If the target hides behind a mirror or angles away, you see nothing. Bistatic mode puts the flashlight in one corner while a second observer watches from across the room. Suddenly, you can see shadows, deflections, and reflections that were mathematically invisible before. The MiG's radar warning receiver only detected the main transmitter's signal hitting his airframe, giving the pilot no indication that a silent receiver 40 kilometers away was catching his radar reflection like a mirror catching sunlight around a corner. The geometry meant that even at 500 feet below the primary radar's horizon, the signal bounced off the aircraft's fuselage and traveled to the offset receiver from a completely different vector. The return signal was weak and intermittent, but it was enough to build a fire control solution. They had him again. This time, however, they didn't launch immediately. They had something much more sinister in mind. At 10:03 hours, a Buk-M3 medium-range missile system received the data link it had been waiting for. The crew had been positioned to cover this exact geographic choke point, a slight rise overlooking a valley that the MiG would have to transit in exactly 90 seconds to reach its target. The S-400 had effectively acted as a spotter, handing off the target to the hidden killer. The automated systems on the Buk-M3 took over with cold mechanical precision. The 9S-36M engagement radar went from cold standby to fully radiating in 3 seconds, its phased array antenna already physically slewed to the exact bearing where the MiG would appear. This wasn't random hunting. This was a calculated execution. The central battle management computers had calculated not just where the target was, but where it would be, accounting for terrain masking, the MiG's fuel consumption profile, and even pilot psychology. Ukrainian pilots historically followed the same valley through this sector because it offered the best terrain masking against long-range threats. But today, that predictability was about to become a death sentence. The pilot's radar warning receiver exploded with a new urgent cadence. Buk acquisition tone, signal strength maximum, track mode achieved. He had been ambushed, and at this range, the engagement envelope gave him maybe 4 seconds before missile launch. The geometry was perfect for the Russians and catastrophic for the Ukrainian. He was trapped in a narrow valley with ridgelines on both sides. He couldn't dive because he would hit the ground. He couldn't climb without exposing himself to every surface-to-air missile within 50 kilometers. The Buk had him in a tactical box where every available option led to a smoking hole in the ground. 2 9M317M missiles erupted from their launch tubes, accelerating so violently they broke the sound barrier before they even cleared the surrounding tree line. Each missile weighed 690 kilograms and was capable of pulling 35 Gs in the terminal phase, turns that no human pilot could hope to outrun. The pilot watched the smoke trails climb on his missile warning system, his brain frantically calculating the intercept geometry. At current speed and altitude, impact would occur in 31 seconds. What made the Buk-M3 truly terrifying in this scenario was its guidance philosophy. Unlike older systems where you could break the radar lock and the missile would go stupid, these modern interceptors used command guidance until the final seconds. The ground radar fed them constant course corrections via data link. Breaking the lock momentarily meant nothing. The missiles would just fly on inertial navigation until the data stream reconnected. The pilot had one option that might work, and it was going to hurt. He pulled the control stick deep into his stomach while ramming the throttles past the detent into full afterburner, trading all his carefully hoarded kinetic energy for altitude. The MiG rocketed upward in a maximum performance climb, the G-meter pegging at 7.5. At this load factor, the aircraft effectively weighed 7.5 times its normal mass. The pilot's G-suit inflated instantly, squeezing his legs and abdomen with pneumatic pressure to keep the blood in his brain, but the gray curtain of unconsciousness started creeping in from the edges of his vision anyway. Through the narrowing tunnel of his sight, he watched the altimeter unwind. 2,000 feet, 3,000, 4,000. At 4,500 feet, he fired every remaining chaff cartridge in his dispensers while rolling the aircraft inverted and pulling through the vertical. The MiG traced a perfect barrel roll while the aluminum strips created a radar snowstorm behind him. The first missile tried to follow the radical maneuver, but its control surfaces couldn't match the instantaneous roll rate of the fighter. It passed 100 meters below the canopy, close enough that the pilot could visually see its control fins working to correct the error. But the second missile was smarter. Its guidance computer had predicted where the MiG would be at the bottom of the roll and adjusted its trajectory to intercept. The pilot had anticipated this evolution. Instead of completing the roll as a standard evasive maneuver, he pushed negative Gs halfway through the rotation, bunting the nose toward the ground in an unpredictable direction. The missile corrected hard, but physics intervened. It was moving too fast to adjust to the sudden vector change. It overshot the aircraft by 200 meters, its proximity fuse finding nothing but chaff and empty air. He had survived the ambush, but the maneuver had cost him dearly. Fuel consumption during the max afterburner climb had burned 300 kilograms in just 40 seconds. His airspeed had dropped to 180 knots, barely above stall speed with the heavy weapons load still attached to his wings. And the Buk crew wasn't done. They were already reloading. The 9T-243 transport loader vehicle backed up to the launcher, its hydraulic crane already swinging a fresh missile container into position. The Russian crew had drilled this evolution hundreds of times. It was muscle memory and mechanical precision. The commander knew the pilot would still be in range, still be slow from his defensive maneuvering, and still be vulnerable. He watched the automated loading sequence while tracking the slow-moving MiG on his engagement screen. The Ukrainian was climbing again, this time toward his weapon release altitude. He needed 15,000 feet for the GBU-39 small-diameter bombs to achieve their maximum glide range. That climb would take 90 seconds. The reload would be complete in 45. The math was simple. The Russian crew would have a second shot before the Ukrainian could drop his payload. The third missile launched just as the pilot reached 14,000 feet, followed immediately by a fourth. But in their haste, the Russian crew had made a critical tactical error. They had fired both missiles simultaneously instead of staggering them. It seems like a small mistake to the uninitiated, but in air combat, small mistakes determine who goes home to their family and who becomes a smear on the landscape. By firing both missiles at the exact same moment, they created a single defensive problem for the pilot instead of two sequential ones. The missiles would arrive at the same millisecond, meaning one evasive maneuver could defeat both. The pilot held his course for 12 agonizing seconds, staring down the barrel of the approaching threat while letting his weapon's GPS receivers acquire satellite lock and download the target area weather data. The GBU-39s needed this initialization for their inertial navigation systems. Without it, they would be nothing more than expensive dumb bombs. At 14 seconds to impact, with the missiles closing at 4 times the speed of sound, he pickled both weapons. The GBU-39 separated cleanly from the pylons, their diamond-shaped wings deploying as the pilot immediately rolled inverted and pulled toward the Earth. 7 Gs crushed him down into the ejection seat as the missiles tried to follow the plummeting heat signature. But physics is absolute. A missile traveling at Mach 4 needs almost 2 kilometers of airspace to make a 180-degree turn. It is like a freight train trying to follow a motorcycle that just made a U-turn on a dime. The MiG could flip directions in 200 meters, while the missiles, carrying all that hypersonic momentum, carved enormous, sluggish arcs through the sky trying to come back around. Both 9M317M interceptors overshot, their proximity fuses triggering on empty air as they sailed past the point where the MiG had been just 3 seconds ago. The pilot leveled off at 8,000 feet, his eyes scanning the instruments. Fuel was critical at 1,850 kilograms. The extreme maneuvering had burned through his reserves faster than anticipated. He had just enough kerosene to reach Ukrainian airspace if he flew straight and level, if he didn't light the afterburners again, and if nobody else engaged him. That is exactly when his threat receiver picked up something new, something that made the previous surface-to-air threats look manageable. A search radar from a Sukhoi Su-35S Flanker E appeared on the scope, bearing 240, range 85 kilometers, and closing fast. The fighter had been vectored by the same integrated air defense network that had guided the Buk. This wasn't a random interception, this was coordinated hunting, and he was the prey. The Su-35 pilot saw the MiG on his Irbis-E radar as a bright, struggling dot crawling across his display at a pathetic speed of 280 knots, barely moving in the world of supersonic warfare. The Russian pilot pushed his throttles forward, accelerating through 500 knots. At this closure rate, he would be in optimal missile range in 3 minutes. The Ukrainian pilot had survived the S-400 and defeated the Buk, but those victories had cost him everything. He had no speed, minimal fuel, and no more tricks up his sleeve. The Su-35 barreling towards him was everything the MiG-29 wasn't: modern, powerful, and designed specifically to dominate the beyond visual range arena. The aircraft's radar could track 30 targets simultaneously while engaging 8, and right now, all that processing power was focused on just one depleted Ukrainian jet. The Ukrainian fighter appeared on the Russian screen in perfect detail. Altitude 8,000 feet and decreasing. Speed now down to 270 knots, heading 247 degrees toward home. At 60 kilometers, the Su-35 achieved a hard lock with an R-77 active radar-guided missile. The weapon had a theoretical range of 110 kilometers, but at that distance, the probability of intercept dropped below 50%. The Russian pilot decided to close the distance to ensure the kill. The Su-35 pilot, now critical on fuel, was forced to break off the engagement, leaving the battered Ukrainian MiG to run the gauntlet toward home just as the Bu-39s entered their terminal phase. At 10:14 hours, skimming the farmland at 50 feet, the MiG flew directly into the kill zone of a ZSU-23 Shilka that had been silently tracking its approach. The radar-guided anti-aircraft gun opened fire, unleashing a stream of 23mm high-explosive incendiary rounds at a rate of 3,400 rounds per minute, forcing the pilot to roll inverted and pull negative Gs so close to the ground that the Shilka's radar struggled to distinguish the aircraft from the earth. 3 rounds still punched through the vertical stabilizer and severed the primary hydraulic line. But as the MiG limped across friendly lines with 0 hydraulic pressure and 30 kilograms of fuel remaining, the bombs finally reached their target at the Orakov depot. The first weapon's penetrator cap punched through 3 feet of reinforced concrete before its 16 kilograms of AFX-757 explosive detonated, triggering a massive secondary chain reaction within the stored 152mm shells that vaporized 500 tons of ammunition in 0.1 seconds. Back at the forward airfield, the pilot performed a manual gear extension and touched down at 180 knots, blowing both main tires and grinding to a halt just 50 meters from the end of the runway, completing a mission where $80,000 in munitions successfully destroyed $2.4 billion worth of Russian logistics equipment, yielding a return on investment of roughly 3 million%. This mission forced a measurable tactical shift in the air war, as Russian pilots became noticeably more hesitant to engage near the border, fearing that every low-altitude radar contact could be another bait-and-switch trap designed to pull them into surface-to-air missile envelopes. Meanwhile, Ukrainian intelligence noted that the S-400 operators began radiating for significantly shorter intervals, terrified of the anti-radiation missiles that often follow these precise strike packages. In the grim calculus of attrition warfare, the survival of this specific pilot meant that the hard-won physics lessons of defeating modern Russian air defenses could be passed on to the next generation of aviators, making the entire Russian air defense network slightly less effective with every passing day.